Welcome. My name is Brian Traynor. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here, and I'm happy to welcome a friend and colleague, Professor Dan Bradley of Gonzaga University, another Jesuit university here on the West Coast for the students who don't know. Professor Bradley was an undergraduate at Gonzaga, where he studied European philosophy and liberation theology, including a semester studying with Jean Sorbino at UCA in San Salvador. After graduation, I always admire him for this, he split his time between graduate studies in Galway in Ireland, working in philosophy about half the year, and the other half of the year he was working on commercial fishing boats in Alaska, the kind of like most dangerous catch television. That's how he funded graduate school, which I think is amazing. His research focuses on the intersection of phenomenology and religion, particularly on questions of presence, desire, illusion, and the sacred. And he's published widely in books and journals, engaging figures like Plato, Augustine, Teresa of Avila, Kierkegaard, and Paul Ricoeur. He's currently working on a book called, tentatively, Desire and Method, Truth and Illusion in Phenomenology, Hermeneutics, and the Discernment of Spirits. And he's here today to speak about phenomenology and the cross of Kong and the sacred. Please welcome Professor Dan Bradley.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for the really kind introduction. I have such a strong connection to so many LMU faculty in the philosophy department, so it's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. Also, I can tell your students, I've come across your teachers in conferences and in journals, and I really think they're doing some really important work, so this must be a really good place to be doing philosophy. So today I want to talk to you about the Cross of Kong and what I think it can tell us about some really deep and basic philosophical and theological questions. The place to begin is to note what a powerful and moving work of art it is. I was walking through the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin a few years ago, and I have to say my first interest is in history. Not really political history, but intellectual and cultural history. So when I look at a work of art, I usually am interested in what it can tell us about how its creators lived, what they believed, and what they thought was important. But in this case, I was arrested by it as a work of art. It stopped me in my tracks, gathered my attention, and I didn't immediately run to see when it was made. So it's a really powerful and moving experience. I'm not idiosyncratic in that. It's recently traveled all around Ireland, and it's drawn huge crowds. Everybody really enjoys seeing it. It was also one of the first mass-produced, mechanically reproduced works of art. So color lithographs were produced of these in the hundreds of thousands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So it's phenomenologically very powerful. It grabs our attention, and it constitutes itself as a unity. I'm not an expert in art criticism, but the art critics also tell us that it's an extremely important work of art. In fact, they rank it along with the Art Chalice and just a handful of others as one of the most important medieval works of art. So it really makes it kind of part of our common human heritage. So it's important phenomenologically, artistically. It's also important historically. So I did finally get to learn about its history, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with you now. So if you hate history, I'll try to make this interesting. If you can't stick it, go to sleep. I will wake you up in about 5 minutes. It was built in 1125 in Roscommon for the Cathedral of Tuam in the west of Ireland. So this setting is going to be important for our story. Mostly in human history, a region's wealth is based on being able to control a trade route or the wealth of its agricultural resources. The west of Ireland is a land of mountains and bogs. It's very hard to get anything to grow. And so you will notice as you travel across Ireland, say from Dublin, that you start in the east with these really rich, abundant agricultural fields, cultivated, and as you move further west and the ground gets rocky, pretty soon the fields change from cultivated crops to pasture lands, and the fences get replaced with stone walls. By the time you make it to the far west of Ireland, say to the Aran Islands, you have something like this, right? These little postage stamp size pastures surrounded by a maze of stone walls. It's really picturesque, but it's not very efficient for producing wealth, right? In fact, Cromwell, that bastard, said he hated the west of Ireland because there were no trees to hang the Irish from, and even if you could kill them, there was no soil to bury them in, right? So on the eve of our story, in the early 1100, you have something like this. There were 2 archdioceses in Ireland, one in, well, actually I guess I would say, part of this idea of the poverty of the soil is important for American history. I just wanted to say this in case any of our Irish studies people are here. The Irish have played an enormous role in American history, and certainly they came from all over Ireland, but they came disproportionately from the west. I was talking about that with Brian. If you look at our family last names, my family's last names come from Mayo, Sligo, Galway, the west of Donegal, and I think this is a pretty common kind of experience. There is an upside, really, now for the West. It's extremely beautiful. So it's a beautiful place to go hiking. And because the English didn't want it, it remained really kind of closer to its Irish roots. So by far the most of the Irish speakers live in the West. The great Irish musicians live in the West. So when you feel suffocated from the homogenization of globalism, there's still some unique character and local identity to the west of Ireland. So it's a really beautiful place to go to visit. But from the time of the Celtic Iron Age, when the farming of barley and wheat replaced pasturing of livestock as the basis for an agricultural surplus in the west of Ireland, the West really kind of lagged behind. And so here in circa 1100, you see that there are archdioceses in Armagh in the north and Cashel in the south. There's only 2 archdioceses in all of Britain at the same time, one in York and one in Canterbury. So this tells you something about the importance of Ireland in medieval Europe. You'll also see that these are the beginnings of the trading towns established by the Vikings in Limerick, Cork, Wexford, Waterford, and most importantly, Dublin. Dublin was already the capital of Ireland economically through trade with Britain and with the continent. But nothing in Connacht. Connacht's kind of the blank spot on the map, the west of Ireland. Into this world is born Turlough O'Conor. He became the king of Connacht, and he was really a genius as an organizer and as a leader. He established Galway as a harbor for his fleet, which is right here on Galway Bay. And from then on, Galway is really going to be kind of the window from the west onto the rest of the world. He was also quite cosmopolitan, so he made connections with the bishops in Dublin, and most importantly with the archbishop in Canterbury, who was a Norman by now, right? This is after 1066. And he learned a great deal from the Normans, including how to build stone castles. So he came back to Ireland and he built the first stone castle in Ireland. So the West is on the rise under the leadership of Turlough O'Conor. But in order to be really established, he needs an archdiocese. And to get an archdiocese, he needs a relic. Because in the medieval world, the cathedral has to have something that's going to draw pilgrims. That's going to be the basis of the spiritual life. So from his friends the Normans, he gets a little sliver of the true cross on which Christ was crucified. Now, we don't know too much about this story, about where he got it, and the medieval clerics seem to not have asked too many questions. So there we go, right? But to house this relic, he needs a beautiful work of art. And so he commissions this from an Irish artist. His name is Well Ishu Brathon U Weeknach. I'm glad my wife is not here to hear me butcher her beautiful Irish language. But the name is significant. Just that he signed his work of art is significant. The artist was held in much higher esteem in Ireland than any other place in Europe at the time. So it's rare that we would have an artist's name from medieval Europe. The Irish artists came from the most noble families. And in fact, in Brehon law, their honor price was, for a good artist, was as high as a high lord. So the art was communal. It was for the monasteries and the churches, but it was also an individual expression of the artist. So this works with his new relic. There is an archdiocese established in Tuam, which is right in the center of Connacht in the west of Ireland, and one in Dublin, right? So the West is on the rise, the O'Conor family as well. Turlough O'Conor makes claims to the high kingship of Ireland. And his son Rory is actually unanimously crowned. One of the only times we have an unambiguous high king in Ireland. It's also the last native-born Gaelic high king, because the Norman invasion of Ireland is just around the corner. So Rory O'Conor tries to drive the Normans back across the Irish Sea. He fights them for years, and tired of the fighting in his late 50s, he retires to the Abbey of Cong, even further west in Ireland, almost to the Atlantic Ocean. And he probably brings the cross with him. That's why it's called the Cross of Cong. So here we see just a fantastically beautiful abbey in Cong in the west of Ireland. So Tuam remains the archdiocese, but this would have been the site of pilgrimage to go and see the Cross of Cong. Now, just because Rory failed, this is not the end of Gaelic Ireland, right? The Normans were never fully able to conquer the north of Ireland or the far west. But even more importantly, they did make important changes. They replaced Brehon law with feudal law, thus bringing Ireland much more into the orbit of European culture. But they learned As Gaeilge. They learned the Irish language. They picked up a lot of the Irish traditions. And as we say, they became more Irish than the Irish themselves, right? Kind of famous line. And so we have an unbroken tradition. The culture that gave rise to the Cross of Cong remains for hundreds of years longer. But this is not the case in the 1500s and the 1600s with the coming of the English, right? So the Catholics and the Irish speakers are persecuted, and the Cross of Cong goes into hiding. The power of the archdiocese and the monasteries were broken under the English, right? So now Cong is just like any other village in Ireland. It doesn't have anything special about it, and it's in poverty. but the people keep the cross of Kong literally in a little village cottage in a basket with a blanket over it, and they would bring it out only for very special occasions, just for Easter and Christmas, and for the 2 high feasts of the cross. And we're going to come back and talk about those feasts in a second. So things get worse as things go on into the 17 and the 1800s. This is really kind of a tragic time for Ireland, as the Irish people are increasingly cut off from their past. And this happens partly because of the pressure of the landlords and squeezing as much as they can out of the land. The people move towards this kind of monocropping of the potato. We know this story, right? But this means being cut off from a much richer culinary tradition. I find particularly sad the cutting down of all the old apple orchards. So you have this really beautiful craft cider tradition in Ireland, and it gets replaced by poachine, which is fermented potato, which is, and there's something kind of romantic about it, but it's nothing like the beauty of the old craft tradition. But this being cut off from a much richer culture also happens within Catholicism. The Irish, sort of the Catholic clergy had always, at least to some extent, been cosmopolitan and educated. In medieval Europe, you could rise from a little village if you could speak Latin and go and study in any of the great centers of education in Europe. And in early medieval Europe, this meant Clonmacnoise on the River Shannon. This was the greatest center of learning in all of Europe. And later in the High Middle Ages, you would have gone to Paris, right, or Oxford, or Rome. After the Council of Trent, this idea of an educated clergy became really the kind of the norm. And so to become a priest, you would have to leave your provincial life as an Irish person and go off to become educated, perhaps in the continent, or certainly in Maynooth, just outside of Dublin. But your teachers in Maynooth would have often been trained in the continent, and particularly in Paris. There's always been a strong connection between the Irish and Parisian intellectual life. And there's some great advantages to this kind of a cosmopolitan education, but there's dangers as well. And so the priests were probably getting an education that had at least some Jansenist tendencies, that had a kind of disregard for the body, and some Enlightenment tendencies, which would have a disregard for culture and for tradition. And so the Irish people, in some sense, had a double persecution. Not only the English landlords, but sometimes their own priests looked down on them as superstitious and backwards. Now, we don't want to exaggerate this, right? We know in 2019 that generalizations are always falsifying, but sort of like evolutionary pressures, I think there was over time this pressure for the Irish people to be cut off from their past, right? Certainly, without doubt, we know that in 1839, the unthinkable happens. Father Michael Waldron, may his name go down in infamy, the parish priest of Cong, sells the cross. He sells it to a group of Dublin art collectors. Now, the people of Cong are absolutely heartbroken. They try to raise the money themselves when they find that their priest is trying to sell their sacred, treasured relic, right? And he only gets about the equivalent of maybe $80,000. But the Irish people, the people of Cong can't raise the money. So the people of Cong are heartbroken, but Waldron himself sees only an old superstition, right? A kind of a fetish. Now, partly what makes this so tragic is that in 1839, the tide has already turned away from this Enlightenment barbarism in other places in Europe, right? So for 2 generations, the avant-garde youth in Jena and Oxford and Cambridge had been getting stoned and listening to folk music, right? And by 1839, this was already, Romanticism was pretty commonplace in many places in Europe. Now, Romanticism is coming to Ireland, and the Celtic revival is just around the corner. And this is partly what makes it so tragic. According to legend, in 1870, one of the successors of Father Waldron went to Dublin, and he tried to liberate the cross. Right? He tried to steal it from the museum. But it was too late. He was caught and sent back empty-handed, right? On the other hand, in Dublin, the cross was immediately recognized for its value. And in fact, it really kind of sparked an interest in Irish antiquities. And it led people to go off to the continent, and they found the Ardagh chalice. So in some sense, we wouldn't have the National Museum if it wasn't for the Cross of Cong, really kind of centerpiece of the National Museum. So there we go. We have 3 historical epochs for the cross, from the 1100s to the 1600s. For 500 years, it was a part of this medieval culture in which it was treasured, both as an artwork, but also as a part of spiritual practice, right? Then for the next 200 years, until the mid-1800s, it was treasured by the local people for their spiritual practices, but it was ignored as a work of art. And then for the last 180 years, the situation has been flipped. It's loved as a work of art and revered even as a work of art, but it's cut off from its liturgical and spiritual practice, right? Okay, if you hate history, you can wake back up It's over. But it's not really tangential, this sort of prelude, because it motivates my question. What's the matter, idol or icon? What's the matter with matter? And so what I want to talk about today, the great theme is going to be the philosophical and axiological status of materiality, of the material world. To put it polemically, why was Father Waldron wrong? Why does sensuous stuff and the plastic arts, why does this matter for our ability to know? And in particular, why does it matter for our ability to know God? Now, normally I don't like to start with the question of God. I would rather start with our experience of the world, to see it as beautiful and good, and then move to the question of the ground or the source or the giver of that gift. But the problem is for us as moderns, it's very hard to see the nature as beautiful and good. And partly this has to do, I think, with some mistakes in the philosophy of science. We've overemphasized a certain reading of Galilean and Newtonian physics as really kind of exhaustive account of what science tells us about reality. But it also has to do with some theological mistakes that I think that have infected our experience. In particular, a kind of iconoclasm. Right? Iconoclasm is the tendency to remind us that the sensuous world is not God, and in fact can distract us from God. But in an extreme form, this led certain branches of Christianity to tear the statues out of the cathedrals and to smash the stained glass windows. Now, this is not because the iconoclasts are stupid or mean-spirited. There's some really good reasons to be worried about the sensuous world, to be worried about nature, right? And so we see an ascetic disciplining of the sensuous in all religious traditions, right? Think of the practice of the sun dance, right? I'm talking today about the Irish spiritual traditions, but I'm also really interested in the Sioux, the Lakota. You put a hook through your chest, you tie it to the sacred pole, and you dance until the hook pulls itself out. And you find this kind of asceticism really everywhere in the world. And the reasons are obvious. It's because the natural world causes us pleasure and pain. And so we're apt to misjudge reality on the basis of how it immediately affects us. So we need this kind of ascetic disciplining of withdrawal and a letting go. A little deeper philosophical reflection also teaches us that no amount of finite stuff is ever going to satisfy our desire, right? I want a boat. And when I get one, I'm happy for about 5 minutes until I want a bigger one and a faster one, right? Before I was a fisherman, I grew up in my high school years. I worked for a farmer, a small farm, and he was really an amazing guy. His farm was like a work of art, really thoughtful guy. And he used to say, with a kind of rural self-depreciation, he'd say, my desires for land are really not out of line. In fact, they're pretty reasonable. The only land I would ever want is that which adjoins my farm, right? And on, right? So I think the point here is that to the extent that the natural world presents itself as a satisfaction of our desire, then it sets itself up as a choice, the finite or the infinite, and thereby becomes an idol. So I want to talk to you a little bit about idolatry, and I think Jean-Luc Marion is a really great thinker on this topic. He has a lot to offer. He's one of the central figures in my tradition of the continental philosophy of religion. So I want to introduce you to his work a little bit. I think, though, that he is still overly preoccupied with idolatry. And so I'm going to take a lot from him, but I'm also going to set him up as a foil for my recovery of the sacredness of the sensuous, particularly as seen in the Cross of Kong. So Marion tells us, every image, in order to be seen by its viewer, must precisely satisfy the viewer's desire to see, and the limits and demands of this desire. That is to say that every image must make itself the idol of its viewer. With the image, the viewer sees the satisfaction of his desire, thus of himself. Every image is an idol, or it isn't even seen. He goes on to say that each person must make themselves into an idol in order to be seen by anyone else. And I think this is really prescient. Marion is writing this in the 1980s and 90s, so this is before the rise of social media and Facebook. This is really, Facebook's kind of a finishing school on how to make yourself an idol, isn't it? How to craft an image that will then be acceptable to others, and then you all get a vote on whether the image I've crafted is acceptable to your expectations or not. This is also before the rise of these algorithms that govern so much now of what we experience, right? And the point of the algorithm is to hold your attention. And it does so by appealing to our desires, titillating our fears, sort of capturing our attention, right? So I think this is true, that the idolatry is rampant. It's a particular problem for our time But what Marion and his tradition of post-structuralism go on to show is that this is not just for any particular time. It's part of our very human condition. These dangers are part of what it means to be a rational being, part of what it means to be a knower. And the basic idea is that not only are idols things like golden calves that we create and then worship, thus blocking us from transcendence, but that concepts too can become idols and therefore can entrap us. So to see this, we have to turn to a central philosophical insight. It's one that dominates my tradition of phenomenology as well as Platonism and many others, and that is the wonder and amazement at the fact that the world is intelligible. And this is the idea that I could have looked out the window and lived in a world in which I see undifferentiated chaos, right? Or just a blind buzzing confusion of sense data. But that's not the kind of world that we live in. When I look out the window back home, I see a spruce tree, I see a squirrel, I see the Spokane River, right? We see a world full of things, each of them delimited and differentiated in their own individual unity. Now, it's sometimes hard for us as moderns to see the amazement in this position because we tend to think of things just as taking up a certain amount of space, right? So if you're just coming to philosophy, let me just give you a little second to try and think through the radicality of the fact that the world is made of discrete things rather than just one thing, rather than just reality. So like I said, we tend to think about, my students really think about something as just taking up a certain amount of space, but what delimits it? What marks the end where something ends and the rest of the world begins? On a purely material level, things just blend into each other, right? So let's take an example. You think about your car, where does your car end and the rest of the world begin? Is the door part of your car? Yes, right? Is the paint part of the car? Yes. What about the dust on the paint? No. But what about the dust that's become embedded into the paint? Right? It becomes very hard to think in terms of just that which takes up a certain amount of space. But then we say, oh, the paint is there because it has a purpose, right? It protects the car from rusting. The dust doesn't have any purpose, therefore it's not a part of the car. But this is not just an inside-outside problem, right? Because the backpack on the back seat of your car, that's not part of the car either, even though it's inside. Why not? Because the backpack is there to get carried, right? Like you. The car is there to do the carrying. So notice what happens. It's only the carness of the car, its intelligibility, that defines or delimits the thing and allows it to be individuated as a thing separate from the rest of reality. Now, of course, the car was made by a human being, right? So you might say the carness of the car came from the designer, or if you like to hack things, from the user, right? But still it comes from human beings. But unless you're a nominalist, you want to say that there are things that are not made by human beings that also exist, right? That there are things like rivers and trees and stars and oak trees and goldfinches and glacier lilies, right? That the world is full of this exuberant ontological richness and diversity. So that's kind of the basis of my starting point as a philosopher, is this amazement at the intelligibility of things. But Marion and his tradition are a little bit less enthusiastic about this intelligibility of the world, and for some really good reasons. They worry that when I see something as something, when I experience the Douglas fir or the grouse, there's a problem, right? I see the Douglas fir as good for firewood, the grouse as good for eating. In other words, that in all moments of conceptual understanding, what presents itself to me becomes amenable to my understanding and therefore available for my manipulation, available for my possession and exchange, right? That this is the ground of objectivity. And if we're right thinking about Plato, and that conceptuality is involved in all aspects of experience. You can never experience anything as anything without conceptuality being interwoven. Now, this is a real danger. We find it everywhere. Let me just give you my two favorite examples. The first comes from Descartes. Descartes says you should generally submit to the authorities and not rock the boat, right? Except when it comes to the possibility for grounding our knowledge, providing a sufficient foundation. He says this is worth irritating even the authorities. Why? What is so powerful about this? Well, he tells us it makes us the masters and possessors of nature, right? Again, my other favorite example comes from the etymology of comprehension. Comprehension this is the goal of the intellectual life, right? To come to comprehend the world. But prehendere is the root. Comprehension comes from prehendere. And prehendere has a really ambiguous etymology. It means to understand, but it also means to take possession of. And the connotations are really quite violent, right? It's grab, snatch, accost, catch in the act, surprise, right? And if we go back again, prehendere comes from an Indo-European root, which means to find or to hold. So the monkey with a prehensile tail can grab a hold of a branch and can swing from it. When the human being understands something, we understand things by taking a hold of them, right? And the right hand is significant here. We understand things by taking possession of them, taking them back to our house, right? So on the basis of these worries, this worry about the possessiveness of understanding, my tradition of phenomenology over the last 50 years has turned to a preoccupation with the invisible, that which never comes to appearance and can never be objectified. So some people have worried that this is us trying to sneak theology back into philosophy with our interest in the invisible. But really, this is not the immediate motivation. The immediate motivation is to break out of our solipsism, right? So when Marion's talking about idolatry, he thinks this is bad. Something has gone wrong. Idolatry is not a good thing. But what makes it wrong is not that it's a violation of some abstract moral law or some arbitrary divine command. What makes idolatry bad is what it does to us. It locks us into this solipsistic hell, right? This prison of immanence. The only things that I can ever encounter is the world as it has been conceptualized for my possession. And so there's this deep hunger to break out of that, to find something that I can relate to, something that's not myself, something with which I can have a relationship. And this is a motivation for atheists like Derrida as well as it is for theists like Marion. Now, Marion is really a virtuoso of doing this kind of phenomenology of transcendence, when we encounter the invisible within the visible. And since we're interested in art today, let me give you a couple of examples. One example that he takes from the Western European Renaissance, that of perspective. So he calls our attention to Piero della Francesca's History of the True Cross, 1466, in the Basilica of San Francesco in Arezzo. How chaotic this painting is. There's no space for anything to appear, right, to be delimited, to have its own space to appear as the kind of being that it is. How different, notes Marion, is the peace of Raphael's Marriage of the Virgin. There's a great deal of relief here in all of its senses. Everything has space, everything can appear in its own individual nature. Each thing is ennobled. And what does this? Well, it's the use of perspective, right? The vanishing point, which is an infinitely distant, invisible point, and yet it opens up a space for things to be. While this is all very interesting, Marion notes the invisible here does nothing more than a simple organization of space, a simple choreography of the visible, setting the visible on stage. And there, the invisible exhausts itself to the visible. We see this even more radically in Raphael's School of Athens, painted just a few years later, right? Here's Plato and Aristotle. They're blocking the vanishing point with their backs turned to it. The invisible is forgotten as the world of the visible opens up to philosophical reflection, all right? So what this means is that while the visible and the invisible are mutually intertwined, philosophical reflection tends to emphasize the emergence of the visible out of the visible out of the invisible. So to cite two famous examples of this, this is not a problem. I think there's something really beautiful about this reflection. And let me just give you two examples from my tradition. Merleau-Ponty's reflections on Cézanne and Heidegger's reflection on Hölderlin. So here's Cézanne. He says, I'm going to astonish Paris with an apple. And I happen to think apples are pretty damn amazing as apples. I'm not alone on this. Remember Michael Pollan? He wrote Botany of Desire. So for him, the apple and marijuana are kind of the ultimate completions of our vegetal desire, right? But what Cézanne's interested in is not the apple as an apple, but rather the apple as it emerges out of the background of reality into its delimited nature as a thing. So because we're interested in this process of delimitation, we see the boundaries of the thing depicted. It's not like Impressionism, right? Where Impressionism, everything blends into itself. Here we're interested in the apple, but we don't just have one outline either. We have these multiple outlines as the thing is resonating, emerging as an individual being out of the background of reality. Another example, paradigmatic in my tradition, comes from Hölderlin's poem Lovely Blue. Like the stamen inside a flower, the steeple stands in lovely blue, and the day unfolds around its needle. So in all these kinds of reflections, the subject, us, are called to reflect on the contingency of being, right? Things emerging into being, and therefore to be grateful for their existence. And I think there's a lot to be said about that way of doing philosophy. But what Emmanuel Levinas does is he teaches us to move the other direction, to move from the visible towards the invisible. And so we are going to think about an example of this Levinasian move in which Marion calls our attention to the icon. So he's calling our attention away from the mainstream traditions of European art, which, as every school child can tell you, is rooted in this use of perspective. And so in the icon, Marion's very clear. He says there is no depth. If it's painted with perspective, it's not an icon. And this is not because the Byzantines were too stupid to figure out how to use perspective. It's just that they had a different idea of the invisible, right? And what Marion does is he tries to go on to show us, where do we encounter the invisible in a painting like this? Well, the first thing he notes is that the icon is always a painting of a person, and in particular of a face. So the icon is the icon of a saint, or of the Virgin Mary, or of a Christ. And this means that in peripheral meditation of the icon, we're drawn through the picture to a person, right? In fact, in the deepest experience of the icon, we don't experience an object at all, but a subject in the modern sense. So the intelligibility of this thing is that it too is a subject, that it's a knower. In fact, that it can see us. But the subjectivity of the person depicted here is never exhausted in the appearance. And so Marion is fond of noting that we cannot see the gaze of the other, only the black holes of the pupils out of which it comes. The invisible in this case is not serving the visible, but the other way around. The face appears to point beyond itself to the person that doesn't appear, to the person as a subject. Finally, for our purposes, it's worth noting that the theological defense of the icon is that it points us towards the crucifixion, which is the ultimate encounter with transcendence. So, as Marion says, we see finally no more than an absence, the void of the tomb. So for Marion, the black holes of the pupils in the icon lead to the black hole of the empty tomb. Now, I think many of you are perhaps familiar with this emphasis in contemporary Christianity. I'm really amazed at how much of the spiritual life of my colleagues, and particularly my teachers, is rooted in, or at least compatible with, the claim of the biblical scientists that the oldest version of the gospel is Mark, and that the oldest version of Mark is chapter 16, verse 8. And I'm old enough now to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt when the scientists tell us something, even with great confidence. Remember when we were told to be healthy, we should eat margarine, and that we had no Neanderthal admixture in our DNA. I was very interested in this question. They said we solved it. We know there's none. Or when Lamarckian inheritance was considered like the ultimate backward superstition. And all these things, by the way, are not true. You shouldn't eat margarine. We almost all have Neanderthal DNA, and Lamarckian inheritance is very interesting. But be that as may, let's assume that the biblical scientists are right, that the oldest version of the gospel does end with the empty tomb, right? That alone doesn't decide anything spiritually or philosophically or theologically. In fact, there's really a great danger, I think, in using the empty tomb as a hermeneutic key to explain everything in theology. In particular, what the kind of diverse Christology gets reduced down to one event. So the creation of the universe through the Logos, the resurrection, the Eucharist, all get reduced down to this notion of withdrawal. The result is that any theophanies or accounts of divine presence are rejected as superstitious paganism or as an imposition of Greek philosophy into our pure Semitic religious tradition. Now I'm straying into theology, into theological territory in which I'm not trained, so let me beat a hasty retreat to philosophical ground on which I'm more sure. Marion himself does the same thing. He also is a philosopher, and when he retreats from philosophy to theology, he always calls our attention to a phenomenological account of the experience of the face, in particular the face of the other in an erotic encounter. So I'm going to start by joining him there. He does give us a good description of the way that we find the surrender of the other's will to be erotic, the way they yield to our pleasure. But I think this is a one-sided account that forgets about the importance of embodiment. We're attracted to the other not only as a will or as a subjectivity in a body, but as a body, as an embodied being. And I think it's quite proper that we want to be desired in turn for our own particular embodied characteristics. So I'm going to show you a clip from Monster in Law in just a second here. It's not exactly high art, but maybe there's something important about that. Maybe there's something that this folk art remembers about the importance of the body that's forgotten by our more Jansenistically inclined colleagues and intellectuals. So let me just read a quote first. This is, in an erotic encounter, what do you see in the face? According to Marion, here's a quote, certainly a shape, the lines of the face and so forth. But in the end, these are not really important to me. I might never notice such evident characteristics of the beloved person as the color of the eyes, etc. Is it a matter of distraction or absent-mindedness? In no way, says Marion. I want to see the invisible. My impassioned gaze can see on the face of the other only the sole place that does not offer anything to be seen, the pupils of the two eyes, obscure and empty holes. This is what Marion says, so maybe now we can go to Jennifer Lopez. Her love interest has just asked her for a second chance. Let's see what Lopez says about that.
Give me one good reason.
Something different.
Really? Okay, what color are my eyes?
Well, at first glance, your eyes are brown. But when the light hits them, they change to amber. And if you look really closely around the iris, the color is pure honey. But when you look into the sun, they almost look green. That's my favorite.
Oh, yeah. I guess that was the right answer, right? Good for that guy. And I guess Marion is not getting a date with J-Lo. Right? So A-Rod, he was an old Seattle Mariner, he's not staying up at night wondering if Jean-Luc Marion is going to steal his superstar girlfriend, because he's not going to notice the color of her eyes, all right? So there we go. Okay, we can now return to the Cross of Kong. Perfect, thank you. And we've had kind of a circuitous detour, but I hope along the way we've gathered some philosophical and theological themes that will be at stake in our dialogue about this work of art. I want to take Marion's concerns really seriously, but I hope to do so while at the same time affirming things in their unity, their materiality, their visibility, their intelligibility, in other words, in terms of their naturalness, and in particular in terms of their beauty. But in the face of Marion's worries, it should be clear that we have a tough task in saving the Cross of Kong from his criticisms. For perhaps the first thing that strikes the viewer on seeing the Cross of Kong is its spectacular beauty. Even worse, this beauty is rooted in two interweaving sources. The first is its use of radiant and spectacular materials, the precious metals, the precious stones, and thus it's a celebration of the earth, and in the virtuosic craftsmanship, which is a celebration of our ability to make, our ability to make images. So together, the beauty of the materials and the beauty of the craftsmanship it gathers our attention for sure. And it's hard, I don't know if you can see it on the screen if you're feeling the same way. It just stopped me in the Dublin Museum. But when we see that kind of power, we should also be worried about this problem of idolatry. So we'll talk about the materials in a second. As to the handiwork, it's worth noting that in many artistic traditions, the hand of the artist effaces itself, right? It doesn't want to intrude. So we can think of a couple of examples. The icon, first of all, but also the Japanese garden, here's a beautiful garden in Spokane, but also a lot of contemporary art, right? Where, this art of the objet trouvé, the artist is saying, I didn't even do anything, right? It was already there, I did nothing. And there's something really valuable about that kind of humility. But in the Irish tradition, the virtuoso craftsmanship could not be emphasized more powerfully, right? The Irish artist is saying, look at this amazing thing that I can create. Central to this Irish tradition of craftsmanship is the filigree and interlace. So see all that fancy metalwork on the cross? But even the use of interlace can make a place for the invisible. You see this a lot in Islamic art, where interlace is used to emphasize the emergence of form or things out of the void. And you can see this really powerfully when the interlace is used on a window or a door and the light is allowed to shine through it. But it doesn't have to be that dramatic or that explicit of material standing out against the light. You see this on most mosque ceilings, like this one here in Abu Dhabi. And I think by now, hopefully, if I did my job, you'll see the resonances here with Cézanne painting the emergence of the apple, or Holderlin writing his poetry about the emergence of the steeple against the blue of the sky, and Marion talking about the emergence of things out of the infinite, invisible of the vanishing point, right? But the Cross of Kong doesn't use interlace in this way. It's so brilliant, the materials, and again, it's even more powerful when you see it in person, that there's no depth. There's no place for that kind of invisible here. Right? We're dramatically encountering this thing in its thingness. So in this, the Cross of Kong shares a similar trajectory to that of the icon. We start with that which is always already there, constituted solidly in its identity as a thing. Right? So when there's nowhere to come from, we immediately encounter this object, fully formed. And the icon does this too, right? Why does the icon do it? Well, the icon does it because the face is among the most thing-like of things. If by thing we mean the phenomenological power of unifying sense data into a count as one, into a delimited object, we can't help but be drawn to the power of the face. It's extremely, extremely powerful in self-constitution, in becoming an object. In fact, it's so powerful that we often get it wrong. We see faces where there isn't a face, right? We see a face in the Man on the Moon, or we see faces in the void of a candlestick and of a vase, right? I love these illusions. We even see a face here. Right? This is the Virgin Mary herself appearing in a grilled cheese sandwich, right? And it was subsequently auctioned on eBay and sold for $28,000 to an internet casino. So there we go, right? Well, yeah. My students, David, said this looks more like Madonna the Virgin, right? Right. Okay, the point is to note the power of self-constitution of the face, right? And beautiful things have this same power. So when we look at this scene, despite the general prettiness, we're drawn immediately to the flowering cherry. Why? Because of its spectacular beauty. Its beauty grabs us, constitutes as a count as one. In phenomenology, we generally use the metaphor of the horizon, because things need a horizon usually to stand out against in order for them to become apparent, for them to become visible. In this case here, the poppy doesn't need a horizon. Its beauty alone is enough to constitute it as an object. And you might say that's a trick because it's the contrast of colors, right? But it doesn't need this kind of contrast of colors. One of the reasons we love alpine flowers so much is that their color is often really the same as the granite or the turf out of which they emerge. And it's their beauty alone that really allows them to emerge into their being as a thing. Right? So perhaps with more power than anything else, beauties and faces provoke their own self-constitution, their identity as a count as one or as a thing. And this is why beautiful things can often act as idols, as Marymount and others so persuasively show us. But I think they can also, like faces, beautiful things, point us towards transcendence, that they can be the beginning rather than the ending of a relationship. So I'm going to argue that the Cross of Kong, like the icon, functions both to gather and to disrupt the objectifying gaze, as we're called through the object towards that ultimate encounter with transcendence in the Crucifixion. But that this aesthetic withdrawal is not the last word, for there is a return to phenomenality by which we see transcendence present in the sensuousness of the natural world. So in this work of art, I think we see three movements sort of creatively intertwined. There's a gathering into phenomenal unity, a de-objectifying withdrawal, but then also a sacramental return. I'd love to show you how this works out in terms of function, liturgical function, and in terms of style, but we just don't have time. We're going to get little hints of these, but we're going to focus on materiality and narrative, and even then all too briefly. So we have to pass by the style connection to the old Hiberno-Saxon, the ancient tradition of Ireland you see in the Cross of Kong. Maybe you can just kind of see this very, very fast. You also see an encounter with the brand new and exotic Norwegian tradition. Here's the earnest style from the Sogne Fjord. There's a lot of new encounters in the Cross of Kong with the Norwegians, also with the Byzantines. But anyway, we have to go back to materiality. And materially, perhaps of most prominent note is the use of gold, right? Particularly for this talk. Now, gold is really evocative and distinctive metal or thing, object. It's easy to form. It doesn't tarnish or rust. It's extremely beautiful. It's pure. So Dermot Morin, in my tradition, writes about this in his contribution to Trainer's book, Cardinal Hermeneutics. Gold, he says, and he's following Merleau-Ponty here, is present in nature, elementally simple, as close to unformed hylae as is phenomenologically possible, pure matter, eternally unchanging, incorruptible, and yet ready to be formed into anything. Further, Gold is celebrated for its beauty across cultures. In Plato's Greater Hippias, it's even suggested that maybe gold is the essence of beauty, for as Hippias says, by its presence all things become more beautiful, right? So gold is among the most earthy of all things, and it's among the most beautiful. And this is why it's been emblematic of idolatry, all the way back to the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and before that to the very founding of the Mosaic covenant, right, the golden calf. But the use of gold in the cross of Kong is juxtaposed materially with the wood of the cross of the crucifixion. This important juxtaposition of wood and gold consists precisely in their dissymmetry. The gold is much, much more powerful at capturing the eye. But when the gaze is not allowed to rest in this brilliance, because there are these artistic techniques, the D-shaped ends of the shaft and the cross, their concave curvature, and their rounded intersection, and this draws the eye ineluctably towards the center, towards the central crystal. It's glass now, but once it was a crystal, which again is very earthy, right? It's rock, but it's been polished until transparent. And so we see through the crystal to this little piece of wood, to wood in all its simple poverty, just a little splinter of the wood of the cross. So the pressured treasured gold doesn't give away to some beautiful mahogany artwork, just a little splinter of wood. And further, the whole cross was built just for that purpose, just to house the wood. So the temporal priority of the gold, we see the gold first, gives way phenomenologically to the ontological priority of the wood. Wood in all its simple poverty, which points to the spiritual poverty of the crucifixion. Now the splinter of wood was lost long ago, so for us, contemporary viewers, the poverty of the wood is replaced by an even greater poverty. That's a lost sliver of wood. And so for us, we have an empty space there at the center of the artwork, right? Which sounds very much like Marymount, right? Up until now, we have the ultimate horizon of the narrative, which is one of withdrawal. However, in the cross of Kong, the crucifixion is also connected to the tree of life. Oh, sorry, we were supposed to draw ourselves in there, right? Draw into the central circle. But the cross is connected to the tree of life in the cross of Kong, this artwork. And the key moment is, again, one of materiality, the wood of the cross and the wood of the tree. With this material connection, the narrative is set free from the historical and allowed to open up onto the cosmological. Thus, it's true that we're narratively displaced towards the historical past in a process by which the phenomenal draws us beyond the presence of materiality towards the invisible. But this is no longer arrested absolutely with the blackening of the horizon during the crucifixion or the blackness of the empty tomb. For via the wood of the cross, this artwork does point us backward from the present to the crucifixion, an event that happened some definite number of years ago. But via the wood of the tree of life, we're drawn backwards again, this time from the crucifixion to the Garden of Eden, which is an immemorial mythical time, outside of secular time altogether, and therefore an encounter with the cosmological. There's also some interesting stylistic connections made between the artwork and the cross of between the cross and the tree of life. We just don't have time to see them. Anyway, these material and stylistic elements, as rich as they are, still rely on the ultimate form of the narrative, which is that of the story. And the story about the connection between the tree of life and the cross that our artist is calling upon was a part of the oral tradition in which the original viewers of the cross would have been immersed. But because we've lost so many of our folk traditions, it's little known to us. So we have to return to Piero della Francesco's History of the True Cross. As the story goes, Adam and Eve were banned from the Garden of Eden, but when Adam died, his son Seth planted 3 seeds from the tree of life in the mouth of his corpse. So they lost the fruit, but they still had the seeds, right? And these seeds sprouted, and fertilized by Adam's composting body, they sprouted and grew into these magnificent trees, a cedar tree, a cypress tree, and an olive tree. And they lasted for many centuries, until the time of Solomon, who had them cut down for the building of the temple. At least that was his plan, which seems to make sense to me for the sacred temple. But the wood of the trees refused to be used for the temple. And so he laid them across a stream to make a footbridge. Then the Queen of Sheba crossed this bridge on her way to Jerusalem, and overwhelmed with feeling at their sacred import, she falls to her knees to revere this timber, saying, "Guard this wood carefully. The world will tremble again before it." So Solomon had the wood buried to keep it safe, and centuries later it was dug up in the time of Jesus to be fashioned into the cross. Significantly, this is not the end of the story or of Piero della Francesco's frescoes. So the Romans, after the crucifixion, buried the cross, But in the 4th century, it was found by the Empress Helena. And here we see it being dug up under the watchful eye of the Empress. But they found 3 crosses corresponding to that of Jesus and the 2 thieves. And they weren't sure which one was which. But the true cross was revealed when at its touch, the corpse of a dead young woman was brought back to life. So note here the themes of uncertainty, we don't know which one is which, and the tragic loss of life. So we have a kind of epistemic and ontological poverty, and it's healed by the touch of the wood of the cross, right? And it yields understanding, and it yields the return to life. Again, the story continues. In the early 600s, the Sassanids conquer Jerusalem, and the Emperor Chasros II, having a high respect for the cross, steals it and brings it with him back to Persia. So here's kind of an inter-religious expression of respect. But the Byzantine emperor, several years later, rallies his troops, goes back to Persia, finds some wood, brings it back, and has recovered the wood of the true cross. All right, so there's many, many interesting details, I think, in that story. The prominent place of women in this folktale, the role of the Queen of Sheba as the first one to prefigure the adoration of the cross, the fact that the wood refused to be used for the temple. So I think there's a lot of fascinating things that maybe we can talk about afterwards. But the point to take away here for us is that in the medieval period, the church, both East and West, celebrated 2 great feasts. The feast of the invention of the cross, which is when Helena found it. Invention in Latin means find, so the finding of the cross, and the rescue of the cross from the Persians. So the pilgrim who made her way to Chum, well, now to Kong, right, where the great reliquary was being held, would approach the cross of Kong, and through the touch of the fingers or the kiss of the lips, the cross would be made present to the pilgrim, with the confidence that it would bring wisdom and knowledge the way that it did to Helena's people. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, on the Feast of the Cross is venerated with incense, placed on a bed of flowers or basil leaves, and processed through the beautiful gates, where it's venerated by the people with the prostration of the body or the touching of the forehead. This material withdrawal towards the poverty of the old dead wood, and then the return to life with the smell of basil, the aromatic smell of the basil, the beauty of the flowers, this reenacts the narrative story of the cross, right? The timber was buried, it was lost to touch and to sight, dug back up, buried again, dug back up, stolen, and then returned. So there's this continual process of loss and recovery. In a more theological register, it's worth noting that the Catholic Missal pairs the story of Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, alienated from the tree of life, with the feeding of the 5,000. And this is clearly a prefiguration of the Eucharist, right? So the fruit that was lost returns as the bread of life, which is a communion with the divine nature. Okay, so the crucifixion is marked by a conceptual withdrawal. There's no doubt about that. The horizon is darkened, and we cannot see anything at the crucifixion, right? The sky goes black. This is mirrored in the Ascension, where we also lose our sight as the horizon is again is obscured in the Ascension, right? But this time because of an overbearing brilliance rather than a darkness. But in both cases, the withdrawal is completed by opening a space for return. Not a return to the same, but a creative and an enriched return. So the Eucharist following the crucifixion, Pentecost following the Ascension. Finally, through the association of the tree of life with paradise, we're drawn through the artwork, through the cross of Kong, to the end of secular time, and the eschatological hope for a complete renewal of heaven and earth. Thus, it's clear, to me at least, that like Marion's icon, the cross of Kong draws the gaze through itself towards the crucifixion, understood as a withdrawal to the invisible, and in this way, the objectivity of the artwork as a thing is undone. And the intentional gaze is taught to relinquish its desire for adequation as it submits to a transcendence that it can never fully objectify. So there's this moment of withdrawal. But through the link with the tree of life and the Eucharist, the transcendence towards which we are drawn returns sacramentally to sacralize all of time, both cosmological and secular, from the creation of the Garden of Eden right to the present in the experience of the Eucharist, and into a future that transcends secular time as we look towards the tree of life in paradise. Space is sacralized as the cross is processed through the church and often out into the streets. In the movement of the arms of the cross pass through all the cardinal directions, and the shafts connect heaven and earth. So in this reversal of the reversal, the first reversal is the withdrawal, and the reversal of the reversal is the sacramental return. Phenomenality, which is the givenness of lived experience, returns not merely as the hylae for the intentional constitution of objectivity. It's not merely for the stuff of the thing, of the object, but as a manifestation of divine grace in the smell of the basil and the flowers, the smell of the candle, the taste of bread and wine, the radiance of the stained glass, and the touch of the lips, even to gold. So I think this allows us to rethink the gold of the cross of Kong. If our eyes are drawn to the center of the artwork, as they most certainly are, we don't have to force them to stay concentrated on that ever intensifying withdrawal. We can allow them to return from the center to the periphery, from the transcendence of the void to the sensuousness of the material. So in the juxtaposition with the poverty of the wood, or better, after the ascesis of the wood of the cross, the gold of the cross of Kong offers a second possibility, the possibility of a sacramental return. Once the cross has been set free from idolatry through ascetic practice and a participation in this phenomenal withdrawal, then the elemental gold used in the artwork is no longer an embarrassment for a modern people preoccupied with overcoming idolatry and destroying golden calves. In the direct encounter with the beauty of the cross of Kong, we are shown the beauty of nature as a shining forth of the infinite beauty of the divine. So if it's necessary, as Marymount suggests, that the opaque world of objects become transparent, which I think is true, that's only an ascetic stage on the journey by which the world can be seen as translucent. So let me end with a quote from William Desmond. He's a contemporary Irish philosopher. And he says, "To see the world as golden would be to speak well of being." Thank you.
Late, we've got time for some questions, if anyone has them.
I have a question in how crosses like this one or icons would have been experienced at the time within a church interior during a procession lit by candles.
Right.
And I think it's perhaps interesting to consider in relation to your discussion of materiality and also absence and presence of the relic and the visibility and invisibility of the relic behind the crystal, that in the shimmering of gold, especially gold filigree, that would create, with candlelight, a kind of scintillating surface. You wouldn't necessarily be able to see the relic, just as like with an icon, if you have a silver revetment or silver and gold revetment that exposes only the face of divinity, that face can sometimes appear dark. So it's almost like this kind of darkened void in the surround of reflective metal. So.
Well, no, thanks. I think that really kind of fits in with this idea, right? That this is the beyond what can be experienced. And I like the idea of little peekaboo glimpses of the wood, right? You might be able to get a little glimpse of it, but it's not anything that can become available to us, right? No, thanks. I think that's really... It's hard for us to experience that, right? Because now it's in a museum in Dublin in a glass case, right? And so it's hard to get a sense of that liturgical experience of what it originally would have been like, right? Other ideas?
Well, I'll give you 3 quick questions
Sure.
whether they're relevant
I'm ready
or
to
not.
pay.
I will about pay a lot and show.
Sorry?
your
Oh,
wife-
no.
My bad.
Thanks,
Okay.
man.
Uh,
On Shilpa, on Leirlan. This is kind of the extent of my Irish.
are you acquainted with the icons that this Southern California woman has painted of the heroes of the Irish Revolution?
No.
If you give me your card with your email, I'll see if I can send you.
Please, that'd be great.
And have I forgotten the third question? Oh,
Do you have her name off the top?
What?
Do you have her name off the top of your head?
The name of the
The name of that artist?
I have aphasia.
Sure.
The third question is, I'm from San Pedro, which used to be a hot fishing port, and there was an Irish-American fisherman or two, and Americans, unlike yourself, didn't want to work in fishing. So he put an ad in the Irish Fisherman's magazine, and he brought some, in the wintertime when fishing is not good enough,
Right.
he brought some Aran Islanders,
Did he?
and they brought their wives.
Wow.
Yeah, but they didn't want to socialize with the Americans.
Huh.
Were you aware of that?
Well, when was this?
Back in the 60s, he was also president of the Commercial Fishermen's Organization, which, as you know, is always fighting with the sports fishermen
Right.
for fishing rights.
Yes.
And he was the eloquent spokesman on TV commercials here in California. Some people may even remember that. Unfortunately, he never. So that's all I have to
No,
say.
thanks a million.
Comment on the
The
menu.
connection to the sea in the west of Ireland is so important. And I talked a little bit about the famine, but the very far west suffered much less than anyone else because they had fish to eat.
But kind of to hell or Canuck.
Yeah.
But
To hell or kind of, yeah.
but the far west, they suffered less.
They did because they had fish.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Yeah. No, thanks a million. It's
Oh, how right.
yeah. Jigglich.
Oh, that's terrible.
It seems to me that a great deal of what you said could have been said with relation to virtually any work of liturgical art from the Middle Ages or say before, I don't know, the 14th century or thereabouts. Apart from the sheer excellence of the craftsmanship, is
Yes.
there anything really distinctive about the Cross of Calm in particular in relation to the philosophical, theological, reading that you're doing here? I mean, well, again, apart from
Yeah.
it's just such a superb example,
Sure.
are there other reasons for you taking this particular work of art?
I as a phenomenologist, we look for paradigmatic cases, and I think that would maybe I'm happy to think that there's lots of ways in which this process of withdrawal and return is gonna function. I like the particular idea of the empty space in the middle. Even the icon, even the relic itself is missing.
Do we know the
right?
circumstances under which that was lost?
When they found it in the 1800s, it was already gone, right? But I would. The desire to be individual or distinctive to me is not a real motivating factor. So to the extent to which this narrative is going to make sense of all medieval art, then I'm happy to see that. What else would I say about that? The story is also fabulously interesting, right? And I had a personal experience with it. Maybe this is one of the things that grounds my research on it.
I went through that whole museum in a state of awe.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? And I've talked about this as well, Brian. Gold for me never would have been very attractive. In fact, my ring is white gold so that it doesn't shine. And my aesthetic, I guess, just would have not been very, I wouldn't have been very drawn to gold. But the experience was the Irish. I mean, the Irish have always loved gold. So you think all the way back 4,000 years ago, and the pre-Celtic Neolithic peoples, gold was that was what they were known for. In fact, known all over Europe for their gold work. And I'm starting to find it much more attractive. Reading Tolkien and looking at this, the earthiness and digging gold from the ground, right?
Tolkien prefers silver.
Oh yeah, that's true. The starlight. Yeah. Dave?
Maybe kind of following up on Eric's question of what distinguishes this work of art, because you also commented a bit on the importance of the face,
Yeah.
Our attraction to the face.
Yep.
What strikes me, maybe this is just my own personal history, there's some sense of me that, well, there's no corpus on this cross. You pointed our attention strongly in the middle, but there's something lacking, something not there, there's something missing. And I've noticed because it's gold and there's a whole artistic tradition there. But could you say something about what's going on there? That there's something missing in a way from a piece of work of art like this?
Because it doesn't have a face?
Because there's no corpus at all, it's just not corpus.
Well, maybe that's helping me think of what's a little bit more distinctive about this, right? I think we have an overemphasis that value is reduced down to human beings in the modern philosophical tradition. And so I'm happy to recover a sense of deep spiritual value in something that's not connected to the human immediately or directly, right? And that's distinct from the human gaze and therefore human subjectivity. I mean, part of my work as an environmental philosopher is to say, there's value outside of human beings in the natural world. Right? Does that speak to you a little bit? Does that seem...
Yeah, it's just, I mean, this is sort of what I'm...
Do you find this uncompelling?
My question is, perhaps, it's just, what is distinctive about this, I'm thinking, is that it's gold, it's material, as you point out,
Yep.
and it is utterly, in a sense, inhuman. Maybe it is also because the so-called authentic cross is missing.
Well, the Irish also don't do a huge amount of human figures,
Is that true?
right? I mean, there's a lot of geometric designs, Celtic knots and so on. And the interlace, if we have any pictures, is animals. So they love animals. These are, it's hard to see them, but they're animal figures interlaced, and then geometric spirals and so on. But and you know, Celtic spirituality is very interesting. So Marymount draws our attention to the Byzantine world, which is kind of on the margins of Europe. But Europe is dominated by Latin speakers and Germanic speakers. Almost everyone in Europe, except for the Irish. The Celtic speakers are outside that cultural orbit.
Hungarians.
Sorry?
And the Hungarians.
And the Hungarian and the Basques, right? There's a few these little islands of non-Germanic, non-Latin peoples, and so maybe that again it's outside the Renaissance humanism, right?
And I was fumbling around with a similar kind of non-question about this, and in response to the previous remark too, I think part of the reason that this works well as a test case for your argument is the fact that although there's no corpus, it doesn't need the corpus, because if we go back to the original intention here of this cross as a reliquary, and how specifically a splinter of the true cross, which is a functional second-class relic because of its contact with the body of Christ, right? That splinter of wood is only meaningful in that the splinter of wood is thought to have had contact with the body of all bodies, right? So, so to your riff on absence here, absence is functioning in so many different ways. Not only the very real present circumstances of the fact that the thing is empty,
but
that the thing when it was there was itself always pointing to this other body that itself is also no longer here because it has ascended in that way. So I mean, there's absence upon absence upon absence upon absence in this particular cross, which does distinguish it from other works of art that you might have talked about, other crosses that you might have taken up in this kind of meditation.
No, thanks.
No
that's helpful.
Again, but I was just
and
trying to think my way through that as well. Why is this distinctive? I think it does.
Yes, thanks. And of course, my work is to say, despite all these withdrawals and absences, there's also the return. And so not only is the wood connected to the cross, which is a secondary relic, the body is gone, it's also a connection to the tree of life, connected to the body, to the Eucharist, in which the body becomes materially present, right? What's that, Kenny?
So, yeah, I just want to say, first of all, I just thought this was lovely and inspiring.
Hey, thank you.
So I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
And one of the things that I'm just kind of laboring with here is that whole, the idea of the absence and renewal and recovery and that whole cycle also resonates. I have this suspicion sometimes that my need for the icon is a result of my own limitation. Like if I was just very deeply attuned to the chair, I could have a similar kind of, it's a failure of my own to not attend as in the same way, in the right way, to the flower or the tree or the chair or Jonathan. That's probably pushing it too far, but leave Jonathan aside.
Sure.
Like I need the beauty and all of the elements that you described because I'm weak in a way. And if I were better, I wouldn't need it.
This is a very interesting question. It's something I struggle with. I think it is part of our human psyche. We need to segregate the sacred from the profane psychologically. And this is something that we don't do in America. So I was reading John Haidt, and he says his whole insight came from going to India, where we don't just have this homogeneous space, where not everything is like a Cartesian grid, where everything is the same. There are sacred places where you take off your shoes. And so I'm wondering, I'm with you. But on the other hand, do we really want a Twinkie mass, right? Where even the profane is sacred, and how do we navigate that tension? Because in one sense, that's true, right? So I would push back against people who want to limit hardcore the divine grace to the 7 sacraments. And I'm interested in the sacramentals, by which sacramental grace overflows into all aspects of human life. But is there a limit there? And is this only a limit of human beings? I think so, right? I think in some kind of eternal life, each atom just radiates and glows with beauty and goodness. Right?
Because I don't want to say that at the risk of making it sound as if, so there's nothing special about the cross of Christ, because it does seem to me to be remarkably special, and
And I think there's something about our American spirituality that says, I don't need to go to church, I don't need this cross of Kong, I don't need anything. I have my own individual spiritual life. My skipper used to say, he's a Lutheran, it was a Norwegian village, I don't need to go to mass. I worship God in the great outdoors. It was just an excuse not to have to go to church, right? But I don't know, I think it's a very interesting question that I don't know how to fully address.
Speaking of Norwegian churches, how old is that wooden church?
This one here is 900 years old, and made of wood, the original wood. Wood, as Barry says, well preserved and looked after, can last for hundreds of years. Isn't it beautiful?
Yes.
I want to go there. Look, it's spectacularly beautiful.
Well, my favorite Irish woman doesn't like the Norwegian, or not the whole Scandinavian wooden tradition. She does not like. She's Irish and she likes stone.
What stone? Yeah. Where is it? Did I miss it?
There it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that something?
Yes.
And then there's the work on the doors of this church on the Sonia Fjord. Aaron?
So you talked about the ways in which asceticism can help protect us from the move to idolatry. I wonder if you could say something about practices or education by which we can help ourselves participate in this return of sacramentality. So that what's going to help me learn to attend appropriately such that I can see the goal in the right way after I've gone through the ascetic.
Well, this is my whole life is what I'm thinking about at the moment, right? My students say, Dr. Bradley, I just found Hinduism. They have so much regard for the body. It's beautiful, the postures. I'm like, yeah, right. Christianity is supposed to have all that too. But it's something that I think we've lost a lot of, right? And so I'm starting on Tuesday when I get back to lead my students in the Liturgy of the Hours in the morning prayer. And this is a practice that sacralizes the day, the rising of the sun, the noontime, the sun going down. When I did my PhD in Galway, so this is one of my connections to Ireland. And when I was there, the archaeologists found this sacred well, and they knew it was connected to the sun. But they said, why on earth would the sun hit the bottom of the well at exactly 12:40 p.m.? Shouldn't it be noon? And then eventually somebody realized it was 12:40 on Greenwich Mean Time, and it was 12:40 right there. It was noon right there. It was noon in their place. So this kind of abstraction of space and time. I think the Liturgy of the Hours is a really beautiful practice. The cycle of the liturgical seasons. This has been going on for really 60 years in my tradition of Catholicism, with the liturgical renewal movement. I've heard stories about the old priests used to do baptisms. They had a little baptismal pen, very efficient, use of the pen. Now when we have baptisms, they do elaborate pools, right? And they pour the water over people. So I think there is this deep return to sacramentality in many places.
Well, I'm thinking about in non-Western traditions, you have a lot of the sacralizing of life. In particular, African traditional religions, where there's really not the same kind of separation between sacred and profane, and you do have sacred spaces and parts of the day or certain activities that are recognized as transcendent, we might say. Aside from that, I think of Joseph Smith, the Mormon, as a young man out there having this theophany in the woods, really, and so the space becomes sacralized as the Mormons understand.
Ah, right. Yes.
Or, the burning bush, the site of the burning bush, well, not in the U.S., but
yes.
right. But,
Yeah.
and I think, therefore, there is something really compelling and special about recognizing sacrality rather than, like I tell my students all the time, this idea that, one, I'm spiritual but not religious could be okay. If you had something, though, there has to be something in that container. Because you're always just saying it.
Right.
And so where's the sacrality in it?
Yeah.
If it's a bucket,
right.
What's in there? Nothing.
Yes. For me, this hunger really drives interreligious dialogue and intercultural dialogue. I mean, this is a particularly Western problem, I think, the desacralization of the world, and we can talk to Weber and all the kinds of reasons that it happened. We're really lucky at Gonzaga. We have some strong connections to a couple of Jesuits from Congo and from Nigeria, and a really different notion of time and of the body, and they've been able to share some of that. It just makes me hungry to find all these kinds of connections. The only thing I would say that the West does have, particularly America, is a notion of a kind of the sacredness of nature that emerges out of Thoreau and Emerson. And so we do have a kind of transcendentalism that in some ways filled the gap in that. But again, it's really individualistic. You go find this beautiful place on your own. There's no place for communal ritual. And when it's lacking, I think my students go to basketball games for a lot to fulfill this gap of communal ritual, losing yourself in the hive mind. And I think it's fine, it's not bad, but it's pretty passive and not very participatory. And I think doing something like some of these prayers or rituals is much more involved and participatory, and really kind of richer spiritual life than American football. Right?
But this is sort of a failure of the modern Catholic Church, right? At the end of the day, I mean, for 1,500 years, all of this was true of Catholicism, right? This is a problem of modernity, a problem of the modern Church.
Absolutely.
And that's part of what I think, is the challenge for reconnecting our students to all of this, to recognize that those things in Buddhism or Hinduism or these other traditions that are appealing to them are part of the Church's history. It's just a part that no one tells them about anymore, and that's what your talk has really helped to illumine for us. So how do we get back to those traditions? How do we get back to Hildegard of Bingen singing about things sprouting greenly endlessly in a way that enables them to find those connections that we've sort of stripped from all of this, that we've really kind of boiled things down to the material not possessing sacrality anymore, or just being a beautiful object.
I think the first step is going camping, right? It's hard to understand. I mean, baptism and the beauty of the water isn't really meaningful if you've never been thirsty and hot and sweaty and needed to be washed clean, or ran out of water and spent 5 hours walking, waiting to get to that creek.
And this is where you get Teilhard de Chardin getting into trouble, right? When he can't celebrate the Mass in China and just engaging with the natural world. And we're only finally kind of letting him back in the door a little bit, but it's okay.
Maybe a couple more.
I'm happy to present.
Just coming back to where Aaron started with asceticism. Asceticism itself is sacramental. I mean, it's a very strange notion that there's some kind of opposition there. It's the contrary, that it's the rejection of asceticism that says, oh, the body doesn't matter, it doesn't matter what we do with it, indulge because it has no spiritual significance. You can't have sacrality of the material without asceticism. So ascetic practices, and that's something that, again, moderns really have a big problem with, but this very strange notion that asceticism represents some kind of rejection of the body or the material. It's just, I mean, it's theological and metaphysical nonsense.
Sure. It's also just purely sort of Epicurean nonsense. You can't enjoy a meal until you've been hungry. And so it's kind of the cycle of fasting and feasting, the feast doesn't make any sense without the preparation, even on a purely kind of experiential level of pleasure and enjoyment. So I take your point a lot.
There is a movie in town, I think it's actually well-known in Pasadena, called The Sinkhole. It's a Celtic horror film. And of course it's based on, Ireland is limestone and there are sinkholes all over the place. And they are sacred. And if you go looking for them, the locals will always pretend they don't know anything about it. But, I found one and I went down into it.
Wow.
But at New Grange is man-built, so the sun's shining in there at a certain time, so that means there were human astronomers.
Yes.
How are they ascribing the sun hitting there at noon on a certain day if they're just natural sinkholes, as they are in Florida and other places?
This wasn't a natural sinkhole. It was built by the people. It was human built.
How long ago?
Well, they think it was part of this Neolithic culture, right? So prior to...
I was totally unaware of that. You have brought so many different topics, not just philosophy.
Where did you learn your Irish?
Colossi Lorgan, Iconiwaio, August UCLA, believe it or not.
Okay, right. Very good.
There's a class right now going on down at the Coffee Cartel Coffee House in Redondo Beach in Riviera Village, Thursday nights, about 5-ish.
Right on.
The Gaelic League is quite active here in Los Angeles.
And it's really taken off again. Well, I mean, wealth and poverty are so interesting relations to culture. But in the 80s, no Irish people wanted to learn Irish. It was really like beaten into them, they hated it. But by the time I was in Galway in the 90s, there were pubs you could go into where it was forbidden to speak English. And I would just sort of order a beer and be quiet. But, so the young people are, there's again a resurgence of this interest in culture.
I ran into a Breton woman. I've been in LA for many years, and I've met 2 Bretons. And her grandmother spoke Irish, but they did not want the children to speak Irish. Pardon, I misspoke. I meant the Celtic language, and I chose the wrong. The Breton grandparents did not want the Breton kids to learn Breton, or Brèche, as they call it. And she knew 1 or 2 words. and it's rather sad. And they had more language freedom under the Nazis than under the French.
Oh.
Well, because they were the master race, the French and Breton were equal. So the French were it, and Breton was suppressed.
Was suppressed, yeah.
That's a well.
And we can stay for some questions
Sure.
after. I want
Oh,
people
yeah.
to be able to go.
Yeah.
Any last questions, especially students? Any student want to throw out a bomb at the end?
While you're thinking, let me say thank you for coming on the Friday of spring break. I'm just blown away that you students came. It really shows a...
Why don't we? So we can hang out a while and still have questions,
Sure.
but I'm mindful of some people who might
Yes.
need to get to the airport
Yep.
or other things like that. So if we could just thank Dr. Bradley one more time.
Thank you.